Okay.
Good morning and welcome all.
Good morning.
I'm Rebecca Friedman and I'm the director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at FIU. Welcome everyone today to episode 3 of season 2 of Coffee and Conversations, Museums and Histories of Anti-Blackness. We first started this webinar at the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic and quarantine some months ago by now, in order to try and understand how cultural institutions are handling the changes before us at this time. The pandemic, however, as we now know or have always known, is not at all isolated. Rather, as we continue to see the need to end anti-Black violence, we acknowledge the overlapping pandemics of today, deeply rooted in the past. Today we'll emphasize the significance of centering Black lives and experiences in museums and cultural institutions, and the challenges of working against the powers at institutions, and the field of public history or society more generally, that have historically sought to erase, marginalize, or whitewash Black histories and experiences. Today, we are lucky enough to have 2 excellent colleagues and guests, both from Vizcaya Museum and Gardens here in Miami. We have Joel Hoffman, the Executive Director and CEO, and Wendy Wolf, the Deputy Director for Learning and Community Engagement, both at Vizcaya. So welcome so much, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're very happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just very briefly, the format before we get started with our conversation. The format's super simple. The 3 of us will simply talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience for the remaining 10 minutes. So at any time, members of the audience, you can submit a question using the Q&A chat button at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so let's get started, guys. Can we get started with each of you telling us a little bit briefly what it is you do, describing your work and everything that you do at Vizcaya, just to give us a sense and some context. Thank you.
Wendy, why don't you start?
Sure. As Deputy Director for Learning and Community Engagement, our department manages all of our learning and community programming experiences for adults, for families, for teachers, faculty, students of all ages. We also manage our vibrant volunteer guides and greeter program, leading tours and welcoming visitors to the site. Also our admissions operation, so we are welcoming all visitors to the site and throughout the estate.
As a museum director in 2020, I'm pretty much a jack of all trades, Rebecca. I'm, on some level responsible for overseeing everything at Vizcaya, and on the other hand, I'm, so fortunate to have an incredibly talented team of people who deal with so many of the details. But, the work that we are responsible for is caring for this huge facility, its buildings, its gardens and grounds, its collections that span centuries, all of the public engagement and communications that Wendy was referring to, and then the reality of running a small to mid-size business, and I do find myself very often relying more on 5th and 6th grade knowledge that I picked up in math class than I do on what I derived in my doctoral studies in art history, but it's an interesting mix of things.
Yeah, it's funny, makes sense. Okay, thank you. Would you say that the museum field in general, and Vizcaya in particular, have been proactive or reactive relative to concerns about racism and social justice? In other words, is this something the field is now only taking seriously, or has it been more long-standing?
Yeah, thanks. This is definitely a very long-standing and not easily resolved, multifaceted issue and set of issues within our profession. I mean, I started by referencing back to the education that I had that qualified me for this position. Much like academia, there are barriers to people entering our field and assuming leadership positions. But really, since public museums were established in the United States formally in a major way in the late 19th century. I would say there's been a push and pull. There have definitely been organizations that were really established as having a major public-facing mission. You've got someone in the early 20th century like John Cotton Dana, who established the Newark Museum of Art really as a place to serve the public. And the dialogue was certainly different, and it's always different from decade to decade, but it's been there. And then you've also had museums, especially art museums, that have really seen themselves as repositories for collections and places of collections research. And so, you know, I'd say that that dynamic has ebbed and flowed over the course of more than 100 years. You know, in the later 20th century, museums started to take this more seriously in conjunction with the civil rights movement. In 1992, the American Association of Museums established a document called Excellence and Equity in Museums. And that was the first time that that kind of accrediting organization took a really strong stance on the principal purpose of museums being not just to promote excellence, but also being about equity in places that were available for everyone. You know, 20 years ago, I took a job at the Brooklyn Museum of Art at a time that that institution was really rethinking its relationship with the public after having, you know, grown up as an institution that was really serving a principally white public in Brooklyn of the, you know, late 19th and through mid 20th century. Brooklyn's demographics changed dramatically, and the director of the organization at the time, Arnold Lehman, really focused on how to structurally and in terms of content think about making this big ship, this established ship, much more of an organization that was going to be about, you know, serving an African-American, Caribbean-American public. And I just say, I think here, this is definitely not new to us. I love the brief that you provided for this conversation. If we can touch on a tenth of it, that would be fantastic. But I will say at Vizcaya, this has certainly been a passion of ours for the 16 years that I've been here. We've got diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion within our core values. We have a committee dedicated to advancing these issues within our organization. Our strategic plan is looking at ways to diversify staff, including leadership on staff, diversify board, diversify volunteers. So, you know, we're nowhere near solving this issue, but we have certainly been thinking about it much more seriously. Lastly, I'll just say that, you know, I think the American Alliance of Museums a couple of years ago realized that despite all of the good talk on this topic, change was just not happening quickly enough. And so that organization has really prioritized this dialogue. And, you know, I think the field is prepared, but has a lot of work to do.
Thank you. That all makes a lot of sense to me, and the kind of institutional steps that you describe are very familiar. You know, having already now talked to a number of institutions and working in one myself, a very large one. Could you say, either of you say a little bit more, if I could push you, specifically with Vizcaya, with your museum, and even other museums, what are some of the core issues shaping the conversation about racism and social justice? So in other words, I understand the kind of institutional response, making sure there's more equity and inclusion, diversity and all of that. But if you could say something about the issues themselves and how they impact the work that you do at Vizcaya, or what you see at other museums amongst your colleagues. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to be a little more dominant at the beginning, and Wendy's going to be a little more dominant at the end. And I'm just going to warn you, as I explained to Rebecca, I did not expect to be in my office, but had to be here due to a problem at home. And I've just gotten a notice that my computer is running out of battery power, and I'm not exactly sure what to do about that. So you may lose me soon, and that'll be just fine. But
Wendy.
I will, you know, just say that Vizcaya is very different than many museums out there that were established as public institutions, you know, over 100 years ago. Vizcaya was established as one individual white man's home, and you know, it has served as a public institution for 2/3 of its history, more or less. But you know, there's no question that places like Vizcaya and museums in general suffer from concerns about accessibility and elitism and what type of content is being presented. I mean, you know, there is, Vizcaya is, I would say, conceived of, understood as, and experienced as, you know, the creation of an individual, wealthy individual from a certain time and place. There are no doubt ways in which an institution like this and other museums may be off-putting just to begin with, let alone have challenges in terms of their content. There's lots of debate about, you know, whether content that is perhaps inherently white can be interesting to people of lots of other cultures. And I think, you know, that can be condescending to assume it is not. You know, I think we find that really not too many people live like James Deering did. We find most people coming to Vizcaya are, you know, kind of overwhelmed by the excess, by the history, by by the beauty of the experience. But you know, we especially face this challenge of we have a very fixed experience. We have set our sights on talking more about social justice and race at Vizcaya, but it can be pretty challenging to do that when you're standing in a room filled with 18th century furnishings. We've brought in contemporary artists to help us grapple with this as well. Those tend to be somewhat abstract statements. I think in general, there's a lot of goodwill in the field, but not a clear sense of how to be assertive and aggressive enough about how to realize fundamental change. So clearly in other types of museums, the types of acquisitions have very much been dominated by racist and sexist choices over the years. The way that those materials have been presented have certainly been presented in what might be called sort of a hegemonic view of the world that is told from you know, a single position of white authority. I graduated from graduate school, you know, almost 30 years ago. And again, this is not new conversation, but I think the question is, how do we do this in a more meaningful way now? And, you know, fundamentally also, I'll say, in addition to the barriers for people entering the field that exist, museums are organizations that are reliant on private wealth. And that certainly can inform the dialogue. There are many people of wealth who are deeply committed to a public mission and others who are less so. So.
Thank you. That's all really, really fascinating. Okay, I'll just move on with our questions. I want to ask you many questions, but I'll just stay disciplined here. Okay, with all of the recent highlighting of anti-Black violences we've been discussing, including police brutality, the murder of George Floyd, and so many others, and these calls for social justice and Black liberation in the US and of course beyond its borders, what role do you see? So this is more of a kind of just imagine, right, kind of question rather than what's in fact going on. What role do you see for cultural institutions like the ones you belong to? So not just Vizcaya, but also your colleagues and various networks you might be part of, where people are beginning to do, or already, as you suggested, doing such necessary work. So what would you kind of suggest for them in this fight for social justice in this moment? I mean, I know you mentioned that this is an ongoing conversation, of course it is, but is there something particular to this moment that either of you might suggest for cultural institutions? Not an easy question.
Well, jumping in, something that we're really focusing on at Vizcaya right now is amplifying Black voices and raising the profile of local Black history, and especially for us thinking about Black Bahamian history in Coconut Grove and the intersections there with Vizcaya's history. In February of this year, we launched what we thought would be an in-person program series, The Rich and Forgotten History of Coconut Grove. It's a partnership that we entered into with the George Washington Carver High School Alumni Association. So really hearing directly from what we refer to as matriarchs or legacy neighbors of Black Coconut Grove to really help share that history, raise the profile, bring it to the surface. And so right now we're really pivoting and thinking about how we can continue to share that history and story, perhaps in an online platform or a virtual type of experience. Additionally, very recently, really in response to recent social injustice, Vizcaya has launched the Black Voices Project. And it's really a 3-component digital content initiative. There are conversations, and some of those conversations come from the programmatic series that we launched in February, as well as new interviews with some of our Coconut Grove neighbors, thought leaders, historians, really just diving into, again, amplifying voices, bringing to the surface the history of our community, histories that have been hidden. And it's also a little bit in the vein of share the mic or share the mic now, also partnering with Black partners locally to give them a social media takeover for a day. So that's something we'll do once a month. And just last week, we did that with Andrew Quarry. So really just trying to think about the issues that are important to our community and how we can raise that profile. And on site, we're really, we're thinking about how we can co-create. So we've recently launched an engagement advisory committee. We're really only going to be, any institution is only going to be as strong as it's meeting the needs of its community and meeting its community where it is. And so really intentionally bringing new voices to think with us about how we can engage and how we aspire to engage with our community and how that can really align with what's important to our community, what we're thinking about, what challenges we're facing. And that's really to get at co-creation so that we're creating with people from the start and not in a silo and not alone, and making sure that the needs we meet are reflective of our whole community. They're representative of the diversity of our community, and that the people creating programming and creating experiences and messages for cultural organizations include our community members as well. And again, are representing the multitude of diversities that are here in Miami.
Thank you. The programming all sounds wonderful. And my first response is we want to collaborate. So hopefully we'll have continued conversations about that.
We're a perfect fit.
Yes. I also might mention, just since you talked about Coconut Grove and the Bahamian community, is that the Frost Museum at FIU actually was planning on, I think still planning an exhibition. So there's lots of possibility for collaboration. So I just have to get that out there. Thank you. Can you guys say a little bit about how you've interacted with other cultural institutions or professional networks, whether here in Miami or around the nation or world, to learn from one another? How have you been approaching these kind of dual pandemics from a collaborative point of view, both COVID and the anti-Blackness racism around us?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned that we're working locally with the George Washington Carver School Alumni Association. And through that, in the last month or so, throughout May and June, they networked us with a partnership between Ransom Everglades School, Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church, and the City of Miami Commissioner Ken Russell's office to provide weekend meals and a food pantry for families at Francis Tucker Elementary School. And it was important for us to get involved with that because we were really looking for a way that we could give back to our community now, and how the coronavirus and pandemic have really created specific challenges for our neighborhood, and we wanted to participate in some of those solutions and some of those pivoting projects. And Vizcaya has also been a part of a global organization known as Of, By, For, All. We've been a member with them since April 2019. It's a global network that works with civic and cultural organizations, especially to make internal and structural changes so the organization can become more relevant, inclusive, and sustainable. And you achieve that when you're representative of your community, when you're co-created by your community, and you're welcoming for your community. And in February of this year, History Miami is also affiliated with Of, By, For, All. And so we partnered to host a retreat welcoming national and global colleagues to really think about inclusion, sustainability, representation, and how to apply this work in our organizations. And if Joel were still here, he would mention that he's meeting bi-weekly with leaders of arts organizations in Miami, and he's also meeting monthly with similar organizations throughout the country as well.
That's terrific. It sounds like you all have a full plate. Even though Joel disappeared on us, you have a lot of really good work going on. My last formal question, and then we can see what the audience has to ask, is really maybe more about COVID than anything else, is whether or not kind of these times have transformed your work and the work at Vizcaya for the duration, right? So how have things changed? And then, you know, when we ask that question, somehow maybe we're just an optimistic people, but can you say for the better? I mean, the worst might be obvious, right? So are there ways in which it's opened things up for the duration?
Well, for what it's worth, and in full disclosure, Joel is listening in, but he can't participate as of yet. But he is here in one way or another. Yeah, I think, you know, for me, Joel and I were talking yesterday, and I think the world is changing so quickly around us that in some ways there's no other choice but to embrace change and just change how we work. And it would have been great to have warning, and it would have been great to have a roadmap, but we don't. All we can do is really dive into it. And I think in some ways, because everybody is faced with changing in one way or another, it makes it a little bit easier to do it, and to also know that there is some collective support out there to do so. And also really thinking about the importance of not doing this alone, whether it's logistically and thinking about the coronavirus and its effects on operations and engagement, or whether it's thinking about social justice. This isn't change that we should undertake alone or in a silo. If it's going to be truly transformative and lasting, we really need to work collaboratively with others, and others who represent the many identities in our communities as well. And these have been dominant mainstream topics, and you know, we're really hoping that as we go through this change, that people will expect these kinds of experiences and conversations from Vizcaya. Maybe it's not how they understood Vizcaya in the past, but we hope it's how people will understand Vizcaya in the future, that it's a place where you can have a conversation about issues that are important to us: environmental sustainability, social justice, how to contribute to the wellness and health of a community and its cultural vitality. So hopefully that will shift some expectations as well.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like you're already doing the work to make that happen. So thank you. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience. At the moment, we have the first question that we have is from our colleague Susan Gladstone, the director of the Jewish Museum. She says, and I suppose this is in the context of programming about anti-racism and all of this, she says, I'm also including anti-Semitism in my upcoming programming. Do you think other museums should also include this? There's a long history of anti-Semitism in Miami, she says.
Absolutely, Barbara. I think anything museums can do right now to support equity in all of its facets will be important. And I think it's important that cultural institutions really understand its community and how different injustices are present. Maybe they're more or less present in different areas or in different periods of a community's past or present, but recognizing what's there and understanding the inequities that exist is obviously a very important first step. So I would say for sure, and I think that's also why it's important that so many institutions dedicate themselves to this. There are some cultural organizations that will be able to have stronger conversations, maybe based on their collections or based on their mission. And that's important to recognize each other's strengths in these conversations and how we can each contribute in very specialized ways.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question myself, if I may. One of the things that's very much interested me about the dual pandemics, or especially the coronavirus pandemic, is the ways in which it's created global networks. Certainly it has for me as an academic, it has for us as a public humanities lab, and for many, many colleagues that I know across the world, that, you know, ways in which we've been forced in some ways and it created opportunities for global conversations. I wonder if from the vantage point of Vizcaya, maybe it's not fair because of the nature of the museum, but I'm still curious if it has kind of opened up or created the possibility of more kind of global interaction moving forward.
You know, I think that's what we hope for. Prior to the pandemic, Vizcaya was welcoming 300,000 visitors a year, and many of those visitors were coming to Miami from all over the country and all over the world. So we know that visitors to Miami and to cultural institutions and organizations in Miami bring a diversity of world experience and life experience with them. So I think it is important that we're talking about these issues in a larger and global context, and really understanding how Miami integrates, how our history and our present experience integrates with others around the world, building that commonality, but also learning from each other, and how our conversations and how our initiatives and approaches to change making can be strengthened with and from others.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Hi, Joel.
Oh, Joel's back. Hi, Joel. Welcome back. We missed you.
I missed you too.
All right. Well, there's another question, so maybe you want to take this one. This question is the following. Vizcaya is often seen as an example of settlement in early Miami. Have you considered working with descendants of the original Bahamian community of the West Grove to shine a light on the contributions of the Bahamian community to early Miami, or to shine a light on the drastic differences between those experiences?
Yes, definitely. And I think Wendy may have already addressed some of that. So since you've got such an articulate spokesperson for that project, which has really been a big part of what we're focusing on, I'll turn it back to Wendy.
Thanks, Joel. Really what we're focused on right now is trying to collect some primary stories, really understanding directly from women who have family connections to people who were working at Vizcaya or living in Coconut Grove and had an affiliation with Vizcaya in the Deering era, so 1916, 1920s. And starting there, a challenge for Vizcaya and its archives, we don't have full stories of all of the staff, all of the contributors and stewards of Vizcaya's history. So we need to piece them together, and starting with some primary stories from people who live in Coconut Grove and can talk with us and inform then how we can strengthen the intersections between history, Bahamian history, Coconut Grove history, Miami history, Vizcaya history, and really tell a contextual and layered story.
I think I'd add also that I think we learned from this experience also that it is so important to move beyond what might be our normative museum starting point and say, okay, great, there are individuals in a community we'd like to work with. How can they tell our story? But rather to certainly hope that they will bring to us information that will help us understand Vizcaya, but I think just more openly acknowledge that this is really an opportunity for Vizcaya to be part of something much, much bigger than its limited narrative can possibly be on its own.
Oops. That actually, sorry, thank you both. That leads beautifully into what probably will be our last question because of time, which comes from Mark Osterman, a very familiar name to me. He says, "Hi everyone, so good to see you all. Just curious if you would talk about the challenges of expanding museum missions, sometimes outside of the parameters of the original founders' intent, and innovative ways you might communicate those efforts at change and evolution to constitute things that include those who might be resistant to it." Challenging final question.
Mark is a friend and was a colleague of ours at Vizcaya for quite some time, and we miss him very much. This is a really complicated and interesting topic. And I think at Vizcaya, on the one hand, we're fortunate, but also a little challenged that our founder, James Deering, really did not leave us with a mission for Vizcaya. He did not mention Vizcaya in his will. It was his nieces who really spent 2 decades working to make Vizcaya a public museum. And when I got here, Vizcaya was really perceived and presented as a decorative arts museum, largely with historically accurate period rooms. And we certainly, many people over the years did not see it as such, and we do not see it as such at this point. But I think we are fortunate also in being a publicly owned institution. Vizcaya is owned by Miami-Dade County. I think there was really never any question when I was being recruited in the years before that the intent was that Vizcaya should be here to serve the public. And so, I think we have taken steps to really try to move our mission to be much broader, to be less James Deering centered, to be, kind of just much more embedded in larger social issues. And we're talking about social justice now, but equally important to us, I have to say, has been the need for environmental sustainability and our quest for that in our mission, which is so critical to the survival of this museum and our community in the world. So, there are a lot of different things. I think having a board that is not resistant to change is clearly going to be key in any museum's ability to make these kinds of changes.
Thank you. We are over time, which is only a reflection of the really excellent conversation you brought this morning. So thank you both so much for the time and for sharing all the excellent work that you do. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rebecca.
And thank you to the audience. Thank you. And thank you to the audience for listening and participating. I'll just end by saying next week, please join us next Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time when my colleague and WPHL Deputy Director Julio Capo Jr. will chat with Regina Gale Phillips, the Executive Director of the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center, an African American History Museum and Center in St. Augustine, Florida. So we look forward to that. Thank you both very much, and we'll be collaborating soon, I hope. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.